My pleasure to wish you all a very warm welcome this morning, whether it is here in the room or virtually. As I understand, we have people watching in hoping to participate downline. But it's lovely to see you all this morning. This is a joint session between GSF and SEESOX. It's entitled Weaponising Migration, Challenges for Europe. This is our 8th collaboration with South East European Studies at Oxford, normally known as SEESOX, and I'm delighted to welcome them back to GSF. After the enforced absence of our annual events in 2020 and 2021, it gives me particular pleasure to welcome you all back in person this year, despite the rail strike. I congratulate you all on getting here today, not least because SEESOX is celebrating its 20th anniversary. The programme has been in existence since 2002, and the very significant body of research and scholarship it has produced since then on the geopolitics of the Southeast European region it covers is, in my view, unparalleled. We held our first joint event 9 years ago, back in 2013, and our partnership has since gone from strength to strength, and it is, I believe, a very special and fruitful one. I'm now going to ask Sir David Madden to introduce today's event and our panel of speakers in more detail, and to give some background on the inspiration behind it. And he will also chair the question and answer session. David, as many of you know, is a former ambassador to Greece and High Commissioner to Cyprus, and he is a senior member and distinguished friend of StAntony'sCollege, Oxford, and if I may say so, a great friend to GSF as well. David, over to you and to the highly topical subject of today's presentation, Weaponising Migration, Challenges for Europe.
Lord Lothian, thank you very much indeed for that very generous introduction, and for mentioning both the 8 collaborations we've had and also the fact that it's our 20th anniversary, which is a very special date, I think. And thank you all also to Jacqueline for all she does for these events. And we all know how much work goes on behind the scenes to produce the event and the lunch. So Jacqueline, thank you very much for all you do. Michael said I would introduce the speakers. This is a changing task as we face the rail strike and other factors. We were to have had 4 speakers, 3 in the room and 1 online. Unfortunately, Dr. Anastakis, who's the director of SEESOX, woke up feeling ill, so he won't be with us. I'll explain in just a minute how we're going to divide what he would have said into other speakers. Also, shortly to be arriving here is Mehmet Karli, who is the coordinator of the programme on contemporary Turkey at SEESOX, and Aslı Töre, who's a research assistant at SEESOX, and they'll be both joining us on the panel here. How we were to have done it, but we may have to change as we go. First of all, Aslı will say a few words about the conceptual presentation behind migration diplomacy. Othon was to have said something about the EU aspects and European aspects. Başak, who will be joining us online, we've also changed things slightly, and she will look in particular at the EU-Turkey deal and what it means, what lay behind it, what its consequences are. And Mehmet Karli will talk about the domestic aspects and the domestic policies of the deal. So we'll look at this question from all angles. Now, I mentioned changes. I see Adrian's just come in, which means that Aslı will be with us shortly and will join us, and I'll get her speaking at the right point. SEESOX has excellent links in many ways, excellent people, and Jonathan Scheele has very kindly agreed at the last minute to say something about EU aspects and the consequences of migration diplomacy inside the EU, which would otherwise have been what Othon covered. I think we're there. When we get to Q&A, we'll take questions both here in the room, in which case Jacqueline will go around with a microphone, and she will, when we've agreed who's going to ask the question, she will present the microphone. So don't start asking the question before the microphone has appeared, and we're also taking questions online. So I think that's enough from me. Aslı isn't here. So let's start with Başak. Başak, are you hearing us loud and clear? And are you ready to address the room?
Hello. Thank you very much for the introduction. We were going to start with Aslı, but I'm assuming she's not there. That's what I understood from your introduction. My name is Associate Professor Dr. Başak Kale. I am in the Department of International Relations and the Chair of European Studies in Middle East Technical University in Ankara. And I'm also a graduate of Oxford. I had my DPhil in Oxford, and I have long-lasting relationship with SEESOX. So I'm here because of the Global Strategy Forum, their kind invitation, and also the SEESOX kind invitation. So I would like to thank you all, Jacqueline especially, and all the other involved stakeholders who were organizing this. So we have a little bit of a change of order. So I will be mentioning a little bit about what Autumn would be saying with respect to the role of the EU. And I would also like to mention a little bit about the practical implications of what migration diplomacy basically means, and how it is then being utilized by the EU, and with the inspiration of the EU, how it was utilized by other countries around the world, and what kind of aspects it will be having in for the refugee protection in general, for migration diplomacy and foreign policy relations in particular. And then I will be mentioning a little bit about the implications on Turkey, and then I will leave it to Mehmet Karli, who's a colleague, who would be talking a bit more about talking more about the Turkish domestic politics. The conceptual presentation was going to be made by Aslı, but as she's not there, maybe I can say a few words for you to introduce the concept of migration diplomacy. I'm very familiar with the issue of the foreign relations and diplomacy, but more recently, especially in the last 2 decades or so, we see globally the impact of population movements in foreign policy relations. And these population movements, either through forced migration reasons, when I say forced migration, is people who are not voluntarily moving from one location to the other, but forcefully removing from one location to the other, has a drastic impact, not only in countries that we would expect conflicts would arise, but globally, there has been an impact. And it has a kind of an impact that has a spillover impact that will have social, political, economic, as well as security-related implications. And what we see is that as a response, different countries, including Western countries, who are also the signatories to the 1951 Geneva Convention, which was developed and produced after the end of the Second World War, have been developing different methods and mechanisms, how to respond, how to impact. And these kind of different impacts, we see that have different implications, all the developed international refugee regime, international human rights regime, as well as the foreign relations in general. I see that Aslı is here. I can continue, Aslı, or if you're ready, I can switch back. I was talking a little bit about the migration diplomacy, but I can continue whatever the chair thinks that would be the most.
I think, please continue, Başak.
Okay.
You're nicely started, so continue.
Okay. So that's the migration diplomacy. So what we see is that these population movements have been used as, in a way, an ingredient in terms of developing different policy applications between different countries, either being bilaterally or multilaterally developed. Bilaterally, it's more straightforward, but within this a multilateral framework, we see that international organizations, civil society organizations are being involved, and it has repercussions not only related to the human rights regime or the refugee regime, but we see that it has implications on various other aspects. So it is not only limited to the migration policy, it became quite an important aspect of foreign policy relations. And that was the case that we have seen after the 2015. You will remember the summer 2015 and how the EU has responded to the 2015 summer with the 2016 Turkey-EU deal. So with this introduction, I will cover a little bit more about how the EU kind of responded with different solutions. The EU has been developing various innovative mechanisms to investigate the root causes of migration in order to offer better socioeconomic opportunities, both to the migrants and also for the host communities. And these different mechanisms, tools, and actions require multi-country bilateral and regional assistance tools to support different partner countries. This is not an issue, this is a transnational issue. Migration-related issues are transnational, transborder issues. So that requires cooperation between different countries. Single countries cannot effectively and efficiently address the population movement issues, either being voluntary or being forced. And these innovative and out-of-the-box ideas include multiple countries and various stakeholders. And they are developed to provide different cooperation solutions at different regions to have a wider impact, both on the causes and also for the implications of migration. The Arab Spring and the civil war in Syria have been creating human mobility in the neighborhood of the EU. And EU have been for a long time in search for a creation of a safety, stability, and security zone around itself, with the development of various programs and actions. And since the end of the Cold War and the Balkan crisis that we have seen, it's been realized by the Europe that these kind of ethnic strife, civil wars, can be at the center of the European continent. And it's like back to the Second World War. And we have seen that EU was not necessarily prepared to respond to these kind of, mass movement of refugees. Because the 1951 Geneva Conventions, for those of you who might not be so familiar, the 1951 UN Geneva Convention for the status of the refugees is for individual status applications. So individuals who are fleeing from the Cold War regimes were expected to come to the Western world and they would be applying for the refugee status. It was not necessarily prepared, or it was not necessarily expected that mass movements would happen. So the 1951 Geneva Convention was then prepared in the Cold War context, and it was prepared with the old goodwill that the asylum seekers would be individually coming. So when these ethnic strifes happened, ethnic wars happened, civil wars happened in Europe and around Europe, we have realized that there's mass movements of people are coming, and the EU and the EU member states and the countries who are willing to become the EU member states were not prepared for this. So this meant that the EU has to develop different kind of mechanisms. So the EU tried to create a common asylum and migration policy, which was not necessarily very successful in the last 20 years. There are still efforts, but there have been a step-by-step kind of approach where the EU was, over time, had a policy that might be understood as one of some of the foundations of a common policy. And we see that the political implications of migration diplomacy has occurred in the EU through the process of Europeanization, the accession process to become a member state to the EU, and the EU's conditionality. One of the EU's most successful tools, foreign policy tools, have been the EU's accession policy. When we look at the EU's new member states since 2004, that's been like an addition of 12 plus another one more recently, 13 EU member states have gone through this EU conditionality framework where they have to make certain reforms in their democratic systems, the institutions, rule of law, and as well as their economies. So that was an important and critical impact of the EU, and it has been worked so well that we have seen many countries joining and becoming effective partners and effective part of the European Union. So we can see that the EU has been a normative power in this region, creating a safety and stability despite all its criticisms in certain aspects that maybe it's not perfect, but at the end of the day, we can be assured that the EU was able to become a normative power in this region, creating peace and stability. And the reform process for the new member states have been quite effective. But over the time, we have seen that through the migration diplomacy, there has been a shift through this conditionality framework, where there have been some negative impact on EU's conditionality, because all the requirements for the EU, in order to have some sort of bilateral and multilateral interaction with different countries around the region, have become more transactional. So the focus have been not the democratic kind of reforms, but mostly on creating a stable neighborhood around the EU. And that kind of created a democratic backsliding in these member states, in these countries surrounding the EU. So when this has all started during, as I said, during the summer 2015, when we saw every day the hundreds of, if not thousands of asylum seekers, potential refugees and irregular migrants crossing the Aegean Sea with unsafe boats or boat-like floating objects through the help of the smuggling networks. And we were all shocked, because during that time, the EU's border agency, which is called Frontex, announced that in 2015 summer, almost 1 million irregular crossings were done via the Eastern Mediterranean route. This is the route between Greece and Turkey. Not all of them were Syrians who were running from the Syrian civil war. Only 50% were Syrians, and the other 50% were from different countries, such as Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Palestine, and many other countries not even close to Turkey, from Asia and Africa. So this intensified movement of persons and the increased deaths at sea triggered an EU response that was later criticized by many international organizations and civil society organizations and other stakeholders. So this controversial response in that regard, which was called the Turkey-EU deal, was a negotiation by the EU with Turkey to cover various issues, including easing the burden on Turkey caused by hosting millions of refugees. During this time, Turkey was hosting about 2.5 million refugees and another 200,000 asylum seekers. Today, Turkey is hosting about 3.7 million refugees and about 400,000 asylum seekers. So the Turkey-EU deal in 2016 was aiming to stop this intensified smuggling activity, lower the deaths at sea, ease the pain on Greece, because there was an increased number of asylum seekers, especially on the islands, where the Greek asylum system was not ready to be able to tackle with this, and find ways to integrate the Syrians to Turkey, utilize the readmission agreements, and securing Turkey's cooperation on migration governance, slow down, if not stop, the spillover security implications of this mass movements. Turkey is one of the first signatories of the 1951 Geneva Convention. Actually, Ambassador Talat Miras, it was one of the diplomats who has been behind, it's been said that the geographic limitation itself, which is inherent in the convention. Geographic limitation means that the signatory states can choose to give refugee status for persons coming from Europe or outside Europe. And Turkey has a geographic limitation. This means that refugees coming outside Europe will have to resettle to a third country. When Syrians started to arrive, they were not given any status, hoping that the Syrian crisis will be over and they will return back. But when the crisis continued in 2014, they were given temporary protection status, which allows them to stay, work, go to school, use healthcare and other public services. Temporary protection status is inspired by the EU law or the EU acquis as an implication of the Europeanization process in Turkey, as Turkey has been in the accession process since 2005. The statement, in that regard, pushed for efforts for Turkey to integrate the refugees into the Turkish society and give them opportunities to work legally so that they will stop these irregular movements, and it will at least drastically stop. And the readmission agreement with Greece meant that if a Syrian has crossed the border regularly, he or she will be returned to Turkey in exchange for a registered Syrian would be placed in a EU member state as a refugee. There have been different criticisms about this argument, this issue, arguing that Turkey is not necessarily a safe third country with the description of the EU's own directive. Greek courts ruled against returning refugees back to Turkey on this ground. It has also been argued that the deal had a transactional aspect and degrading the human rights protection issue on a transactional relationship with an accession country that had internal political reform issues and democratic backsliding. It was also criticized that the EU was using border control measures, securitization, and externalization of migration, where it is basically exporting its own internal refugee protection issues to a third country through financial leverage to Turkey by 6 billion euros. Internally, the EU-Turkey statement or the deal triggered the development of changes in the legal framework for international protection and migration policy in Turkey. I'm not going to go into the details of the impact of these changes domestically, as Dr. Mehmet Karli will cover these points. So I would like to elaborate a little bit more on how transactionalism, securitization, and externalization meant for Turkey, EU, and other countries that have been inspired. For Turkey, it gets financial gains. Turkey was quite realistic. In Turkey, this last year, about 12,000 refugees were submitted for resettlement for consideration to 14 countries, and about 7,500 refugees were deported to 13 countries. So when we consider that there are 4 million refugees in Turkey, it will take about 600 years for all refugees to be resettled outside Turkey. So basically, it is not going to happen. So what Turkey decided to do is that to get the financial support, because it was already hosting these refugees. So it was a tactical and practical move. So also they wanted to tackle the smuggling networks and cutting down the criminal financial gains. That was the other aim. And it is not always these criminal networks that you would be imagined from a Hollywood movie. Our research shows that some of these people who are smuggling are entrepreneurs who acquire a boat, and they are bakers during the day and they're smuggler during the night. And additionally, Turkey was hoping to sitting around the same table again with a positive agenda and to be able to be back on track with the EU in terms of bilateral relations. It also involved an international prestige. Turkey convened the Global Refugee Forum together with the UNHCR. And you will remember that during those years, Turkey was quite active as relates to the UN initiatives, such as the Istanbul Convention. For the EU, it also had some practical issues that have been solved, such as the problem solving domestically, internationally, with very little cost. But unfortunately, it also meant that EU's normative values have been questioned, and the EU acquis has been compromised with this deal, as well as the EU accession process in general and the EU's enlargement has been compromised. And through this mechanism and externalization of refugee-related issues within the EU, the burden sharing has not been developed, which we later see that it has been an issue with regards to later on with the crisis in Afghanistan and later on with the Ukraine. This has gave different kind of possibilities for the EU, where in 2016, the EU also proposed an EU-Jordan compact, which tried to basically have a new approach to the Syrian refugees in Jordan. So it was hoping that with these kind of mechanism and economic and political incentives, such as trade deals, a restrictive policy environment can be opened up and funds can be mobilized in a short space of time, so that the more people will get work permits and Syrian refugees will be working in different specified sectors. That was the aim, with different designated economic zones. And similar thing happened with regards to the EU's comprehensive refugee response framework in Ethiopia with the Ethiopian Jobs Compact in May 2018. So with this, the compact was trying to hope that it will create a recruitment and skills development. So there will be industrial parks, inclusive and industrial suitable development to enhance basically the development of possible employment schemes so that people will not be basically leaving Ethiopia to go to other locations as refugees and asylum seekers. I mean, when we look at globally, we see that these different kind of mechanisms was recognized in the Global Compact for Refugees. And it aims for different kind of mechanisms that including like trade agreements or from different kind of EU member states have endorsed the Global Compact for Refugees apart from Hungary. And although the fact that the Global Compact for Refugees is not necessarily a legally binding document, and the European Commission in its recent new Pact on Asylum and Migration makes a very small reference to the Global Compact for Refugees, it is basically a kind of, goodwill kind of declaration by different countries to tackle the issues of the root causes of migration and also the root causes for forced migration. So when we bring up the issue in a comparative aspect, what we have seen so far, we have seen that the Syrian war was not the end of all these discussions. What we have seen is that Afghanistan, for example, has been a recent issue where thousands were also expected to leave the country through Iran. And it just showed that different countries all around the world have to have cooperation in this matter in order to make sure that these movements are managed effectively and efficiently. In the case of the Ukraine, for example, more than 13 million people have fled their homes since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and about 5 million of them are outside the country. Russia is hosting more than 1 million, Poland is hosting more than 1 million, and Romania, Moldova, Slovakia, Hungary, and Belarus, which are the neighboring or more close countries to the Ukrainian crisis, have been hosting refugees. And for the first time in history, the Temporary Protection Directive, which came into effect in 2001 after the conflicts in former Yugoslavia, was first time triggered by the Council in response to this kind of a high number of movement of refugees. And in February 2022, it was the first time that it has been accepted, and the refugees coming from Ukraine have been given temporary protection in 27 EU member state countries with up to 3 years of legal status, which allows them to work and go to have education and also access to services. Other countries have developed similar mechanisms. For example, Canada. Canada is going to be flying Ukrainian refugees from, for example, Poland to Canada. Canada has quite a high number of Ukrainian origin citizens in the country, and these people would be not required to have the refugee status to be resettled in Canada. So that's an interesting kind of approach. And it's similar kind of approaches have been developed as well. For example, the Ahan Foundation is now trying to support Afghans who do not have a status in Turkey to be moved to Canada, and especially the vulnerable groups are going to be supported. So as we can see that there are different mechanisms since 2016 that have been developed all around the world with different crises, with different responses for different needs. But the essence is the same. It's about the refugee protection. But what has happened is that there has been a movement from the classical understanding of refugee protection and refugee regime and international law protection, human rights protection, moving towards a more transactional migration diplomacy aspect of things. So handling the migration as a diplomatic measure that will impact the bilateral and multilateral relations. And it becomes a foreign policy aspect, not necessarily a domestic policy aspect. And most recently, the case with the UK and Rwanda, there has been quite a discussion about the human rights protection issues related to what is the UK is doing. And it's also an externalization of migration measures. We can see that where the export of the migration and the international protection related issues to a third country, in the case of Rwanda, where the asylum seekers are going to be hosted and processed in another country. I mean, there are various issues that can be discussed, and I'm more than happy to discuss these during the Q&A session without taking too much of time. But what we can see is that There has been a shift from the 1915 Geneva Convention regime, where the protection of the refugees is a human rights issue, and right to asylum is guaranteed not only by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, according to Article 14, everyone has the right to seek and enjoy asylum in countries of asylum from persecution. That's a human rights. That's a fundamental human right. And within the EU, Article 18 of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights is also makes sure that asylum is a guaranteed right. As well. So we can see that overall, in short, we can see that there has been a switch from the normative perspective when we look at from the EU, who wants to have a global kind of strategy, a global kind of role, a global identity, and a global claim to with a normative basis. And this normative basis having the human rights protection. And the EU acquis has been traditionally supporting and creating the foundation of this normative strategy. But unfortunately, through this transactionalism and externalization and securitization of migration, through the migration diplomacy, we are seeing a shift from this normative approach and becoming a bit more responsive to the populist claims, the populist arguments within the EU and the political parties, and unfortunately the response by the electorates to these populist regimes. Not only EU, but also we can see this trend globally happening all around the world, which is in that respect a bit worrying. When we consider the fact of the normative values that have been developed and that has been exported around the globe from Europe. Thank you.
Başak, thank you very much for a very clear, lucid, and indeed wide-ranging presentation. Thank you very much. Aslı, over to you to look at the conceptual side of things, of migration diplomacy.
Yes, thank you very much, David. And thank you very much, Dr. Kale, for taking over. And thank you for your understanding about our delay in arrival. So I will be summarizing the theoretical framework in which we discuss and try to understand migration diplomacy. Of course, it will be kind of an... I will be emphasizing some of the points that Dr. Kale already has very comprehensively elaborated on. But I will be talking about what it means, for what purposes migration diplomacy is used, how it is used, and very briefly on its links with security and private industries. So I will start with a definition. So migration diplomacy refers to two things. It can be the state's strategic use of migration flows to obtain other aims, or it can be the state's use of diplomatic relations to achieve migration-related goals. So migration as a tool, or migration as a goal of foreign policy making. And in this definition, we refer to states, but it is possible to apply the framework to state-like actors such as the EU or the UNHCR. Compared to other sectoral diplomacies, such as energy diplomacy or environmental diplomacy, migration diplomacy is thought to be more heavily driven by internal domestic goals. Of course, no foreign policy is free from domestic considerations, but migration diplomacy has distinct ways in which internal goals, coalitions, and discourses condition the policy making on the external side. And migration diplomacy highlights the importance of the management of cross-border mobility as an international issue. So the focus is on interstate relations. So the scope is dissociated from discussions on internal displacement, diaspora politics, or any migration management issue that doesn't involve foreign relations or diplomacy. So secondly, we can think about for what purposes states use migration as a diplomatic tool. How does migration become linked with other issues? As Dr. Greenhill very comprehensively explains in her book, one purpose can be enhancing their security. An example of this is the Operation Solomon in 1991, where Ethiopia sought $36 million of arms and aid from Israel in exchange for the immigration of Ethiopian Jews. Another purpose can be economic interests in the forms of direct economic aid, grants, debt relief, or preferential trade agreements. And another example is also Dr. Kale talked about it, the Jordan Compact in 2016, or the agreement between Spain and Senegal in 2006 for 20 million euros in developmental aid to Senegal. A third purpose can be nation building or boosting soft power via cultural or public diplomacy. The US Peace Corps, Fulbright, or the case of Canada granting Rauf Mohammed asylum, or after Turkey adopted an open door policy in 2011, the virtuous discourse Turkey used, comparing itself to the EU. That's kind of soft power. These are examples of this. And so with these purposes in mind, states use different kinds of bargaining strategies to achieve their aims. And the strategy they adopt can be dependent on their position vis-à-vis other states, meaning whether they are migrant sending, migrant receiving states or transit countries. So whether their main concern is immigration, emigration, or transit migration. And these are, of course, ideal types. States can simultaneously hold different positions with respect to different states. And so just to give some quick examples to these different strategies depending on positionality, being a large country of immigration, American immigration diplomacy primarily focuses on immigration from Mexico and other Central and Latin American countries. And also, during the Cold War, it involved identifying potential defectors from the Eastern Bloc, cultivating these contacts, and arranging for their eventual relocation in the West. So receiving states are primarily concerned about the dynamics of immigration. The second category, immigration diplomacy, it is often identified in states of the global south. And Egypt constitutes, for example, the largest exporter of labor in the Arab world. And Egyptian immigration diplomacy in the 1950s and 60s was about promoting the immigration of teachers, lawyers, high-skilled professionals for political purposes, as many of them engaged in pro-Egyptian activism abroad. An example of transit migration diplomacy is, for example, Mexico, usually perceived as a country of immigration, but also a transit, first alienating Central American governments by implementing hostile policies on its borders to stop transit migrants into trying to reach the US, then shifting to a shared responsibility framework. So other than their position vis-à-vis the target country, their strategic location and the size of the refugee population they're hosting can be determinants of the strategy, and they may choose either a blackmailing or backstretching strategy, as it is said in the literature. So the blackmailing strategy can be threatening to flood a target state with refugee populations within its borders unless compensated. A back-scratching strategy is promising to maintain the refugee population within its borders unless compensated. So, as can be seen by all these examples, the use of migration as a strategic tool in foreign policy is neither a recent nor a European phenomenon. But, of course, we talked a bit about the patterns of the European migration policy, but I would just like to make a brief point about the links between security, industry, and migration, which is also relevant to Europe. So the internal power asymmetries and struggles in European politics have given rise to European externalization of migration governance beyond its territory in regions with historical links to imperialism, and billion-dollar industries of border security as well as financial deals with third countries have followed these externalization policies. So migration diplomacy cannot be taught separately from the migration industry. And this industry involves private security companies, also humanitarian aid, work of NGOs, trade agreements, academic research on migration, and also human smuggling activities. These all constitute the industry. And these security concerns and profit interests and racism is right now we are seeing that they're overshadowing civil-oriented border policies based on protection, international cooperation, and mutual longer-term interests. And this trend of prioritization of security concerns and profit interests has consequences, such as the diffusion of what we can call the refugee rent-seeking behavior, which means trying to gain profits from cross-border mobility in both global south, as can be seen by the example of Kenya threatening to close down the Dadaab camp unless compensated by the UNHCR after the deal with Turkey, and also in global north, as we increasingly see. So this, in turn, causes an erosion in rules-based, value-based, and long-term solutions to migration management. And seeing the consequences of shorter-term monetary opportunistic deals, the impact of these on the survival and integration of refugees and on democracies, it clearly reminds us of a need for a more durable mode of global responsibility sharing. And I will pass it on to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for extending our focus and indeed knowledge. Now, as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, Dr. Anastasikis can't be with us today, but we're very fortunate to have on hand Jonathan Scheele, who is willing to give us 5 minutes on EU aspects. And Jonathan at SEESOX has an exceptionally strong background on EU affairs and was a member of the Commission for many years. Jonathan.
Thank you, David. I feel a slight sense of déjà vu because last night I was at Glyndebourne to see the opera, and at the beginning the artistic director stood up and explained to us that unfortunately the tenor had no voice. Fortunately, they had an understudy. Unfortunately, that understudy was sick. So fortunately, they had a second understudy. Unfortunately, he was coming from West Wales on a day when there were no trains. He made it eventually, and they managed to find a way through, and it worked very well. I hope today you'll be equally satisfied at the end, though I fear not. Migration, as has been underlined by previous speakers, has political, social, and economic implications in more or less every state in the world, whether it is a source state, a transit state, or a recipient state, and the reactions vary from state to state. And it's become, I don't know enough about the figures to know whether it is now a bigger issue in Europe than it was in the late 1940s, where you had millions of displaced people. The events post-war which led to the establishment of the Geneva Convention on refugees But we went through many years where it was a pretty minor issue, and it has resurfaced, as was pointed out by Başak. A lot of attention is, of course, given to the Eastern Mediterranean route through Turkey into Greece and the Balkans, but we have also seen significant flows from the South Mediterranean, principally via Libya, and also, and this is often neglected, from in the Western Mediterranean, across the Straits of Gibraltar, through Morocco and Spain. And these have posed differing problems, but they are all the general issue of flow poses a range of problems for the way the European Union and Western European countries have been working. But we should perhaps start with the implications of migration for the source countries, the issue of brain drain. Now, this is a real problem because typically the people who are best qualified, and anecdotally one sees this, the first Ukrainians who have arrived in this country, who've managed to negotiate the mechanisms and jump through the hoops posed by the Home Office, have tended to be educated people who are used to working with the system. They are then followed, and I think this is probably fairly typical of most migration flows, by the less educated but also more dynamic, typically often young males, particularly when they are fleeing war. But there's also an issue that migration is not, as it were, just from outside the EU to inside the EU. Inside the EU, we call it freedom of movement, but in reality, you have had a gradual move of the better qualified people from south to north, from southeast to northwest of the EU, and that poses problems in the countries from where these people are coming. And indeed, when I was working in Romania in the early 2000s, one saw migrants moving into Romania to replace Romanians who had migrated further towards elsewhere in the EU. So there are real issues of internal balance in the medium to long term for the European Union. Secondly, much attention has been given to rule of law issues, and Başak has commented on the Geneva Convention and whether it is still effectively the rule, whether the rule of law, as enshrined in the Geneva Convention, is effectively being applied. But we also have issues of trafficking and the seeming inability of most of the states involved to address the problems of trafficking. But linked to that, you also have issues of what is known as pushback, where the authorities of the receiving country, whether it's a transit country or a final receiving country, are doing what they can to avoid the refugees actually setting foot, because then they acquire a status which they don't have, refugees or migrants more generally. So there are a number of serious issues of rule of law. You also have issues of fragmentation of European Union unity. As Başak pointed out, you can only address issues posed by migration through cooperation between states. But the domestic salience of migration in virtually every country in Western and Central Europe has made that cooperation that more difficult. Hungary has perhaps been one of the more vociferous countries, but it is far from being alone. And that also has impacted more widely in terms of EU policy making, because EU policy making, whether we like it or not, tends to be a bit transactional, and you can acquire leverage, and migration is an element for internal leverage within other arguments. We've seen leverage, not so much from migration, but to some extent we've seen it in relation to Russia, but also the behavior of Poland has arguably led the EU to be a little bit more relaxed about how Poland has been addressing rule of law issues. Hungary is hoping to exploit the same thing. So it tends to create obstruction to be used as leverage in other policy arguments. And that has always happened, but it's that much wider. Implications for aid and trade policy, offshoring, whether in this country or elsewhere. The EU has also gone in for this, particularly with Libya and Morocco to an extent. It distorts the reasons why you give aid. And we've seen this recently in discussions in the United Kingdom as well. I hardly need to say, sitting in London, that Brexit was very much driven by a domestic weaponization of freedom of movement in EU terms, migration in British terms. Paradoxically, the Dublin Convention, which operates within the EU and is intended to send asylum seekers back to the first safe country they were registered in, no longer applies in this country as a result of Brexit. Dublin Convention has incidentally also been undermined because of the conditions for refugees in some of the first-line refugee recipient countries. And so we've had judgments in Germany, for example, that asylum seekers who under Dublin should be sent back to Greece. In fact, Greece is no longer seen by some German courts as a safe haven for asylum seekers. So you've got a lot of complications as a result of the use of migration. And most recently, of course, we've seen in Belarus the direct use of migrants, the encouragement of migrants to fly in from the Middle East, from Syria, from Iraq, essentially to assault the border of Lithuania as a way of undermining, I'm not quite sure what they're trying to undermine, but embarrassing, certainly, the European Union as part of Mr. Lukashenko's bad relationship with the EU in general. So that is very much an issue of weaponization. And finally, of course, and this is perhaps less about weaponization, but you do have societal implications in almost every recipient country of a large number of single young men. And that leads to significant domestic issues. We've seen that particularly in Germany, but not only, we've also seen it in this country because you have localized, I hesitate to use the word ghettos, but you do have localized concentrations of refugees. And how you deal with refugees, do you allow them to work? This is, I think, a debate which this country should be having. So, all of that, what are the challenges for Europe as a result of this? All of that, I think, first of all, it undermines the normative role of the EU and of the United Kingdom as a putative, independent normative power in terms of respect for rule of law. And it also creates significant societal and economic challenges, whether in the source state, where some of those refugees and migrants could be well used, whether it's in the transit state because of some of the issues which arise in their relations with other states, but also in terms of dealing with large numbers of transient people, and finally in the recipient state. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you very much, and thank you very much for stepping in at the last moment and producing such an excellent report. And I'd like to congratulate all three speakers so far for finding endless examples of where migration interacts with other areas of policy. It really is very important indeed. So, Mehmet, over to you.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you. And I have to first, of course, start by apologizing for being late. The strike, as you know, it took 2 hours, 45 minutes to come here from Oxford. Quite a journey. I'm sorry for this. My presentation will be focusing on Turkey and Turkish domestic politics and the relationship between Turkey's migration diplomacy and Turkish domestic politics. But I have to make one thing clear. Of course, the title of this talk is quite attractive. Weaponization of migration. It's certainly an allusion to the seminal work by Professor Greenhill, Weapons of Mass Migration. And as I will be focusing on Turkish domestic politics, I will necessarily be focusing on the case of Turkey. But I have to make it clear that Turkey is certainly not the only country that instrumentalized or that is instrumentalizing migration flows. Aslı and Başak, they have given various other examples. Second, we have to acknowledge the fact that Turkey hosts the most number of refugees globally, more than 4 million. It's an immense challenge for a developing country like Turkey. Therefore, quite a lot of the Turkish demands are actually quite legitimate, but expressed in the wrongest way possible. Third, yes, we will be focusing on the relationship between the EU and Turkey, and I will be giving a lot of examples where you might, of course, feel that Turkey does not have clean hands, which is the case, but EU does not have it either. I mean, no one comes around this table with clean hands. That's one thing that we have to keep in mind. Yes, what I will be just trying to lay down for you over the next 10 minutes is, first, what are the drivers, priorities, and objectives of Turkey's migration policy? And of course, it very much touches upon Turkey's Syria-related policy. Why did Turkey adopt an open-door policy? As Başak has pointed out, out of a total of 4.2 million migrants in Turkey, something like 3.7 million of them are Syrians. They form the largest community of migrants in Turkey. Why did Turkey, in 2011, immediately after the start of the Syrian civil war, adopt an open-door policy? I believe there are 5 main reasons for this, and quite a lot of them do relate to Turkish domestic politics as well. The first one is Turkey miscalculated. As simple as that. Turkey thought that the war was not going to last as long, that just Damascus just would not withstand all this pressure. It would be a long-lived just conflict, and just the opposition would win quickly. And we can actually, and hence, of course, as a corollary to that, Turkey miscalculated the numbers of the migrants that would come into Turkey. I mean, this is epitomized by the statement of the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ahmet Davutoğlu, who stated that 100,000 migrants would be a critical threshold, Turkey. Yes, here we are, 10 years after that, just with 3.7 million migrants in Turkey, he stated that 100,000 would be the critical threshold, and it was a clear miscalculation. The second one is this policy, the policy of open doors, keeping open doors, was very much in line with Turkey's changing foreign policy identity and new foreign policy objectives, especially in the Middle East. As you all know, Turkey, for most of the Cold War, was the Cold War warrior of NATO and a part of the Western alliance. But after the end of the Cold War, just as just Britain found it difficult to find a new role after the empire, Turkey found it difficult to find a new role after the end of the Cold War. And one thing, especially after the AKP and under the ministerial position of Davutoğlu, one role, new direction of Turkish foreign policy was being the leader or the leading force of the Sunni majority in the Middle East. Turkey has played that role. Turkey, some of them, some people called that neo-Ottomanism. We might discuss whether it should be called like that, but Turkey wanted to portray itself, especially in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings in 2011, as the protector of the oppressed Sunni Muslims in the region. That was the case in its relationship with Tunisia. That was the case in its relationship with Egypt. And that is the main reason why Turkey got in trouble with Saudi Arabia and others in the Gulf, because Turkey developed very close relationship with Muslim Brotherhood, Ihwan, in the region. And as a part of that, Turkey wanted to show that it was hospitable, it was going to show that welcoming attitude towards the migrants, and Turkey thought that it could use and utilize those migrants, of course, as a force against Assad regime, and that the war would last short, and those who were welcoming Turkey going forward would be the Turkish allies, natural allies in the new era in Syria. And that was the main understanding. And of course, this foreign policy objective reflected itself in the entire narrative as well. Turkey kept using Islamic terminology while it was describing its hospitality. Turkey did not refer much to international commitments, in 1951 convention, because there is that geographical exception. Anyway, Turkey was the large Muslim power with that Muslim mercy, Muslim hospitality. The terms that were used were Mazlum, which means the oppressed, especially in Arabic. Another term, Ensar, again, it's an important term in Islamic theology that refers to charity or charitable hospitality, because Ensar were those people who lived in Medina during the time of Hijrah, when Prophet Muhammad had to flee Mecca under oppression, and that was the term used in domestic politics and in foreign policy explanations as well. And of course, fourth reason is Turkey used this hospitality as leverage against Western powers in order to collect their support against the Assad regime. As you know well, Western world was in no way decided in their action against Assad. People, just understandably were in two minds as to whether this was the right strategy or not, and especially in its relationship with the US. Turkey emphasized the fact that Turkey was the benevolent power here, the good international citizen, hosting the refugees, under this, during the conflict, and Turkey tried to leverage this in order to garner the Western support against the Assad regime. And fifth, that's something more specific to Turkish domestic politics, the same terminology of Islamic hospitality used in a sectarian manner in domestic politics as well. Whenever opposition criticized Turkish government's open-door policy, they were accused of being pro-Assad, meaning pro-Alawite, and that was a reference actually to the large supporting of Turkey's main opposition party, secular party, by the Alawite secular community in Turkey. Erdogan, being of course Sunni, being a very capable manipulator of that language, made implied or explicit references to the fact that the head of the main opposition party was Alawite himself, and that was a tool that he used when he was criticizing the criticisms of the main opposition against open-door policy. These are, I believe, the five main reasons for which Turkey adopted an open-door policy, and that basically opened the doors for millions of refugees to come to Turkey. However, as second part of my speech, I have to underline that, especially after 2013, between 2013 and 2017, circumstances changed, facts changed, and Turkey had to change its priorities, its main objectives, and of course, the migration policy-related objectives as well. What were the changing circumstances? What are the factors that forced Turkey to change its hand, to change its rhetoric? There are four of them. First, the realization that Turkey miscalculated. The reality, of course, bang you on your face, no matter how much you want to delude yourself, the reality was very clear. First, in 2013, after the use of chemical weapons in Syria, when it became clear that Obama administration was not going to do anything, although this was clearly against their red lines, Turkey understood that it was not going to be easy to get rid of Assad, because the US was not playing ball game, US was not in this game. It was going to last long. Second, of course, the sheer numbers. Look, in 2013, there were around 225,000 migrants in Turkey. And by the end of 2017, over the course of 4 years, it had become 3.5 million. Only in 2013, 1.3 million people stayed in Turkey. In 2014, another 1 million. In 2015, 350,000. In 2016, especially due to the fall of Aleppo, with the support of the Russian forces, yet another 600,000 people. The numbers, the sheer numbers were huge, and they forced the hand of the AKP government. The second reason is that especially after 2013, security of the border, Turkish domestic security has become the priority and made it impossible for Turkey to maintain the same position. Of course, you would all just come up with the idea of ISIS. Yes, the rise of ISIS in the region after 2013 was an important factor. But for Turkish security establishment, more than ISIS, the rise of the Kurdish forces in northern Syria was more of a threat. Because as you know, Turkey's just conflict with PKK and Kurdish movement, and although the official line is that PYD and YPG are not part or are not part of the same organization with the PKK, they are undoubtedly just coming from the background. They are part of the same broader umbrella. And the fact that with the US support as well, YPG, PYD established a safe haven all along northern border of Turkey, which is for 911 kilometers, which is practically impossible to control, was a huge threat for Turkey. And suddenly, taming the Kurdish movement, taming the Kurdish areas in northern Syria became Turkey's priority. And this was coupled with a domestic political development. Turkey had been ensuing a so-called peace process with the Kurdish movement within Turkey, and that came to a halt in 2015. First, due to the conflict between ISIS and the Kurds in 2014, autumn of 2014 in Syria, as Turkey showed an unwillingness to help the Kurds, that caused a rupture within the Turkish-Kurdish community of Turkey. And secondly, in the June 2015 elections, which were very important for Erdogan, the Kurdish movement did not support him. They voted for their own candidates, and Erdogan being Erdogan, he saw this as a betrayal. The elections were in June 2015. In July 2015, he announced that the peace process was over. And that was a clear shift in Turkey's policy towards the Kurds. Now the priority was to clamp down on the Kurds. And the third one, of course, that follows from this chronology as well. In June 2015, one might be tempted to forget that, but for the first time after its coming to power in 2002, for the first time, AKP lost its majority. AKP lost its parliamentary majority in June 2015 elections. It had to form a coalition, and that scared Erdogan. Erdogan did not allow the then prime minister, Erdogan was back then the president, Erdogan did not allow back then the prime minister Davutoğlu to form a coalition, did his best in order not to allow that, and he felt that threat, and as part of that threat, he started getting closer to Turkish ultra-nationalists. He started adopting a much more hawkish language. He actually unleashed the violence within the country so that people could feel more insecure, and as a result of that, in November 2015 elections, he won with 48-49% of the votes. I remember very vividly the article of The Economist following that election, where The Economist said, yes, not only Erdogan won, but he has won in a very dangerous manner because he has understood that he can win elections by shedding blood. This is a very dangerous lesson for any autocrat, and Erdogan saw that. And the final, but last but certainly not the least, the coup attempt in July 2016. That's a watershed moment that changed everything for Erdogan because he felt the gun right next to his head. He felt there's a risk over there. And from July 2016 onwards, ladies and gentlemen, everything that this government has been doing is informed by that survival instinct, by regime survival. And these are the things, these are the main factors that push Turkey to change its migration policy. And finally, what are the current or what are the new objectives? What are the new priorities and purposes of Turkey's migration diplomacy then? First, as there is discontent, understandably, within the Turkish population of having to host more than 4 million people, Turkey being a developing country with a lot of economic difficulties, AKP government wanted to show that it could actually get something concrete in return, financial returns. That's the reason why Erdogan kept using the migrant card in the lead up to the November 2015 Turkey-EU summit, in the lead up to the March 2016 Turkey-EU deal. He wanted to show that there was actual bucks involved and he was getting some money back in return. That was mainly geared for domestic politics. Look, $6 billion that Turkey is still trying to get from the EU is just a drop in the ocean. In the words of Erdogan, Turkey has spent more than $40 billion. I believe this figure should be inflated, but Turkey has certainly spent much more than 6 billion euros that EU is trying to contribute. That was, I believe, that's one of the primary objectives. The second one is that, especially before the coup, and during the Prime Minister's office of Ahmet Davutoğlu, who is now in opposition, we have to keep in mind, another key objective was for AKP to show that they were still a reforming power, they still had a place around the European table, and they were still recognized and actually welcomed by the European powers. And they used this migration diplomacy negotiations in order to strengthen that image. This is epitomized actually by Chancellor Merkel's visit to Turkey in October 2015, only days before November 2015 elections. She was severely criticizing Germany because it was obvious that that was going to be seen as a political sport for Erdogan. Not only she visited Erdogan in one of the Ottoman palaces with ornate decoration before them, she refused to meet even a single representative of the opposition. That was a clear message. Of course, Chancellor Merkel does not want to accept that she made mistakes in her relations with Putin. I believe she wouldn't want to accept that she made mistakes in her relations with Erdogan either, but AKP and Erdogan used such negotiations skillfully to portray an image domestically that they were still an acknowledged, recognized force globally. Davutoğlu himself, after the November 2015 EU-Turkey summit, came up with the words, "This is a new beginning for Turkish-EU relations. We're going to have visa-free travel soon. We're going to have a modernized customs union soon." And migration diplomacy was leveraged to portray or to come across with this message. The third one is, needless to say, Turkey used and has been using migration diplomacy to garner support for its operations against the Kurds, mainly in Syria. Turkey organized its first large-scale operation in northern Syria in August 2016, after having managed to get Russia's permission, of course, but it was only months after the so-called Turkey-EU deal in March 2016, and although this was a large-scale operation, although Turkey was actually attacking the very power that was fighting against the ISIS, the criticism of Turkey by the EU was very much tamed. It did not stop there. Turkey organized yet another operation in 2018 in order to get the control of the Afrin region, which is northwestern Syria. Again, representatives of the nation states, member states, they refrained from using carte language. It was only the EU Parliament that came up with strong condemnation, but immediately after that, Erdogan did not miss that opportunity to raise the migration card and stated that, hang on a minute, you don't share any of the burden here, you have no word to say. And Turkey kept using this card whenever there was a criticism against its Kurdish policy. The same, in a way, happened in 2020. In February, towards the end of February 2020, in a Russian attack, actually, but we don't want to, of course, Turkey does not want to confess that, something like 34 Turkish soldiers, unfortunately, lost their lives. And immediately after that, Russia was the attacker. The event took place in Syria, but Erdogan preferred to attack EU because he wanted to change the agenda, and he threatened the EU by opening the floodgates and sending all refugees over there. Fourth,
Are we almost there?
exactly, almost there, yes, almost there. The fourth point is, it has been used, migration diplomacy, as an enhancer of the now domestically dominant narrative of anti-Western language. A good example of this is in 2017, there was the constitutional referendum in Turkey, and AKP, Erdogan's party, was not allowed to organize demonstrations in the Netherlands and in Germany. And AKP's Minister of Interior, Süleyman Soylu, stated that if you continue this approach, we're going to let 15,000 migrants per week to come to Europe. And last one is, the last objective is to ensure EU's silence as against grave human rights violations in Turkey. European Parliament recommended the freezing of accession talks with Turkey in 2016. The European Council backed this in 2018, and after every single such decision, Turkey raised the migration card and stated that, what do you want? Do you want us to open the floodgates? Yes, these are the new objectives and priorities of Turkey's migration policy. As you can see, as a conclusion, it is largely driven by regime survival and domestic political objectives. But again, as I tried to underline in my introduction as well, this language used by Turkey, this language used by Erdogan, is a godsend, has been a godsend for the EU. EU has not lived up to any of its obligations. EU did not want to resettle any one of the refugees. EU refused to contribute substantially or significantly to Turkey for this policy, but thanks to the language used by Erdogan, they could mask their own failures, they could put Erdogan under the limelight, and they could portray Turkey in the worst possible terms. And I believe the reality actually is summarized, that's my last words, I'm sorry, David, for this, by Amnesty International's statement immediately after the March 2016 deal between Turkey and the EU. Amnesty International said that EU and Turkish leaders have today sunk to a new low, effectively horse trading away the rights and dignity of some of the world's most vulnerable people. Yes, 2016 deal was an effective horse trading away of the rights of those most vulnerable people, but also it marked the horse trading away of Turkey's accession paradigm, the normative paradigm, and the hopes of Turkey's pro-democratic, pro-EU forces. Therefore, that deal, the current relationship between Turkey and the EU, is not a symbol of Europeanization of these relations. To the opposite, it's actually a symbol of the de-Europeanization of the relations between Turkey and the EU. And thank you for your patience.
Memo, thank you very much indeed for a very detailed, strong, and indeed dramatic presentation, which I much enjoyed. Thank you very much. Right, straight on to Q&A. Because we got off to a slow start because of the strike, we only have about 10 minutes. So let's make good use of those. Jacqueline. Yeah, I can't see it actually because there's a bright light shining straight into my eyes. So would you like to summarize it, or should we ask the person who asked it to read it out?
I can read it.
Okay, could you do that?
It's from Sir David Logan, and he says, as Mehmet says, Turkey hosts an enormous number of Syrian and other migrants and has demonstrated a high degree of hospitality in handling this challenge. As he says, attitudes and policies have changed as the numbers grew. There is growing resentment of the impact, for example, on social services, crowding of classrooms, employment, and indeed unemployment. Now resentment is being provocatively fanned by Umut Özdağ in the context of next year's presidential and parliamentary elections. How will President Erdogan react to this, given that he is trailing in the polls?
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. David is, of course, a former ambassador in Ankara. Who would like to go? Başak?
Well, yes, that's quite a right and correct kind of portrayal. Umut Özdağ, Professor Dr. Umut Özdağ, he's been with nationalist parties and he has now established his own party. And his main argument is basically, mostly is focusing on the Syrian refugees staying in Turkey and hoping that they will return back to Syria. And this is going to be the hot topic of this election, the upcoming election. That's going to be one of the breaking points, basically. And it is very, very important. And now we are seeing for the first time, because in the last 10 years or so, this has not been a topic that has been touched. That might be various reasons, which also Mehmet has elaborated. And one of the reasons is that the hoping that it is going to be a temporarity. But the economic situation in Turkey quite dramatically complicated. The inflation has been officially recognized as 60%, but it's been presumed to be about 300% inflation rate. Unemployment rates are really, really high. Talking about food prices, I was in the UK in March, and I remember the Secretary of Finance or Treasury was complaining about the food prices being on the rise, and he was saying that get used to it. Well, used to it, the prices are going to be like this. You've been enjoying quite low prices for a long time, thanks to the EU, if you're asking me, the Common Agriculture Policy, but because of the Brexit, it's not going to happen. And Ukraine, the Ukrainian crisis. Same thing is affecting in a much more drastic scale in Turkey. And when that's the case, and unemployment is really rising, you cannot expect having 4 million non-Turkish people being in Turkey will be a positive thing of reflection for Erdogan. And Erdogan has been using this oppressed Muslim protector role. But if you look at the polls with the research that we have conducted, you will see that unfortunately, the AKP supporters are not necessarily agreeing with this Ensar argument. Ensar argument is being the protector of the Muslim people. So the AKP supporter is not supporting this argument. And surprisingly, 150,000 Syrians are given a refugee status, but they are not planning to go to the polls to vote in the next elections. About 50% is not interested in going and voting for the polls. And the other 50% who's going to be voting are not going to be voting for the AKP. So that's quite interesting. So this is going to be a hot topic. This is going to be a dividing topic. And we will see that except probably HDP, all other political parties will be playing around this. E-Party, AK Party, CHP, MHP, they're all going to be in. Also the Zafer Party with Ümit Özdağ will be playing on this, will be toning their arguments around this topic.
Thank you very much, Başak.
Yeah, Başak has already answered, but just a few additions. Yes, Ümit Özdağ is a Marine Le Pen-like type. He's perhaps cleverer than Marine Le Pen, and he represents his party, represents something like AFP in Germany, and not only they are pushing the government, but he is targeting the opposition. The opposition had adopted a more rule of law based or rights based language up until recently. They tried to do that, but with attacks by Ümit Özdağ and his party, they started adopting a more hawkish approach as well. I believe what's going to happen is that we can already see the signs of changing narrative on the part of Erdogan. He started speaking more and more resettling the Syrian migrants in Syria, and most probably there will be yet another operation into northern Syria. Turkey is currently making the preparations for that, and that operation will be used first in order to create a rally around the flag, and also give across the message that, look, we are controlling all this rent, we are trying to create this buffer zone so that we can resettle the Syrians into that region. And that's gonna force, or that's gonna actually make it easier for Erdogan to organize that operation, because that operation will be important for them, because Erdogan is trying to put a wedge between the Kurdish movement and the opposition forces. In order for the opposition to win the elections against Erdogan, they need to stand together with the Kurdish movement. Kurdish movement makes up something like 13% of the electorate. And by organizing an operation into northern Syria, Erdogan will try to put that wedge between the nationalist forces in opposition and the Kurdish nationalists on the other hand. And he's going to portray that also as a long-term resettlement project.
Thank you very much. Jacqueline, there's a question over here, is that right? Please. Thank you very much, Jacqueline.
Thank you. My name is Neil Brown, and I'm a former visiting fellow at StAntony's. Thank you all very much. That was superb. Can I ask a question really in two parts? I mean, looking at the fragility of North Africa, of energy prices, of food prices higher than they were when they caused the Arab Spring, and no prospect of that changing. When we look at the possibility that President Erdogan will weaponize this again, can I ask, how will President Erdogan, in your view, weaponize it in relation to the EU? And what prospect is there in a year when we have the largest ever representation of far-right MPs in the French Parliament just elected, and we have the likelihood of a right-wing Italian government next year as well? What are the prospects for the EU resolving the conundrum of its migration policy, whether quotas or anything else? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're fast running out of time, aren't we, Jacqueline? So perhaps if you could have a minute or so in answer.
Just a quick answer. Mr. Brown, it's not going to be actually...
Sorry, carry on.
Okay, it's not going to be easy for Erdogan to create concrete effects. We have to come to terms with the fact that Frontex has been working. The EU has put a strong defense along the Turkish border. When Erdogan tried to use the safeguard in March 2020, it didn't work. I mean, very few refugees wanted to go there, and even fewer could make it across the Greek border. That's why it's not given that it's going to give concrete results. However, as you know, perceived realities in politics are more important than the realities themselves. If Erdogan starts voicing this out, if we get to see refugees going to border, trying to cross the Aegean, etc., that might very well play into the hands of the right-wing actors. Actually, this is something, of course, Professor Greenhill just explains in her seminal study as well. Those actors that try to use migration as a weapon, they play into the schisms in the receiving states. This is what they do, what they are trying to do, and Erdogan might try to do that because he's actually more welcome by the right-wing forces within the EU. He gets along very well with Viktor Orban. I mean, he does not care anymore whether Turkey gets into the EU or not. For as long as the EU does not criticize and does not come up with any concrete steps against its regime, so be it. Therefore, he wouldn't mind that. He certainly wouldn't mind that, I believe.
Thank you, Memo. We've just run out of time, but Başak, would you like to give us a final concluding sentence?
Yeah, unfortunately, I would be giving you a gloomy sentence. What's happening in, unfortunately, with UK and Rwanda. I hope that this is not going to go ahead for the sake of UK more than anything. A couple of thousands of refugees, UK will survive, but what it will do in terms of the damages, the prestige is going to last a very long time. But the same thing is true with UK and Italy. I mean, we're going to have populist regimes coming ahead, but despite the fact that the populist regimes are going to coming ahead, there will be efforts to try to make a policy work. And that's always been the case with the EU. Crises come, crises go. And at the end of the day, they try to push forward more reforms. Is it going to be perfect? No. But I still have hope for the EU. But I think we will have to be a bit more patient when things will probably settle down with the Ukrainian crisis, with the post-pandemic impact, etc. Because it's a long marathon. This is not a sprint. As a person who has been in athleticism for a long time.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank all our excellent speakers for a really good presentation of the many angles of this subject. So let's applaud them. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lord Lothian.
Thank you, Lord.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. Really.